Good afternoon, and welcome to today's VetNet Entrepreneurship Track presentation, which is part of our social entrepreneurship series, Hangout number 2, Internal Operations, where we will be discussing structure, organization, capacity building, and governance. My name is Mike Shenik, and I'm the VetNet Program Manager here at the Institute for Veterans and Military Families, located on the campus of Syracuse University. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes on how to participate live during the presentation. For those of you who are watching live and participating within the Hangout, please feel free to speak up or to type your questions in the comment box on the right side of your screen. The comment box can be enacted by hovering over the left side of your screen and clicking the chat function. I will make sure your questions are relayed to the presenters. For those of you watching out on YouTube, please feel free to type your questions in the comment box and they will be relayed to me. And finally, for those of you who would like to just type your questions in the Google Plus event page, please feel free to do that, and I will make sure they are relayed to the presenters also. So, before we get started, I'll let each of our presenters introduce themselves. Gary Shaheen, we'll start off with you, and then we'll let you turn things over.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mike. Hello, everybody. As Mike said, this is the second in a series of 4 VetNet Hangouts on social entrepreneurship. And they all proceed sort of logically, one on top of the other. Last week we began with discussing the mission, the vision, the values that underlie social purpose ventures, and then we had a wonderful presentation by Paul Jenkins, who is the creator of the Veterans Beer company, and they hire veterans, which is the primary purpose of their business, even though they produce some very good beers. Today's presentation carries us on to the next part of the process, which is discussing how you manage your internal operations. It's the nuts and bolts of running a social enterprise, and we're really pleased to have with us Lisa Fasola-Frischman, who is the program coordinator here at Syracuse University for the Maxwell program in citizenship and civic engagement, and Francisco Gonima, who's the owner of Francisco Gonima Executive Coaching and Strategy. I'm going to, and he's also the president of Black Tie San Antonio, and both of them will talk from their own perspectives on how you manage internal operations, and I'll leave their intros up to them respectively. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it on over to Lisa to open our session. And Lisa, over to you.
Thank you, Gary. I'm very pleased to be here, and I know Francisco is as well. My background in social entrepreneurship really started when I became the executive director of an organization called Social Venture Partners Denver, which is located in the Community Foundation in Denver, Colorado. And it's an organization that's an international network. We have chapters all over the country, and even now in Canada and in some parts of Asia, that looks at the venture capital model, but in terms of nonprofits. So different people come together and make donations that are 100% charitable, and then that group gets together and then they make grants to organizations that they have a strong interest in and see that there is an opportunity for them to engage. Once a grant was given to an organization, myself and a team of business professionals from the Denver community would go in and assess the organization from the mission, vision, and values all the way down through their legal matters, their financial planning, looking at their marketing, HR policies, you name it, to make them a stronger, more effective, efficient organization so that they were meeting the community need that they intended to serve. And then when I came to Syracuse, I'm now working in an undergraduate major helping younger students connect to nonprofits and government organizations and thinking about policies and community needs and filling gaps where philanthropy comes in on that angle. Francisco?
Hi. First of all, I apologize for my lack of video, so you just have to imagine. I started my career with the American Red Cross, initially working in disaster management, then over in back to disaster management, and ended up in Washington, D.C., where I was the national executing for the United States, as well as senior liaison to the Department of Homeland Security. So I'm working with folks in different armed services. I spent a lot of time working on catastrophic planning and all kinds of things. And so I think that was really where I began to get an education and thinking in terms of impact, and what is the bottom line value of what you're doing on the affected community, on the affected ecosystem, as opposed to simply speaking services delivered, right? And so that was really the work then for the last 7 years that I've been in private practice, that I've been doing as a consultant, working with a lot of charitable organizations nationally, but primarily in Colorado and in South and Central Texas. And I also do a lot of work on behalf of charitable foundations that do sector building initiatives in an emerging space called collective impact, where you'll put together coalitions of several dozen agencies and public sector stakeholders that try and tackle a fundamental social concern as opposed to simply a single agency's service delivery. And again, from that standpoint, it's always a conversation about impact, not services. So, I love the work. I love taking everything that we do as entrepreneurs as well as the professionals and innovators to these ecosystem systems change as opposed to simply doing good things for people that need it.
That's great. So hopefully today what you'll get from the conversation that Francisco and I would love to lead with you, and we do see this as an opportunity to engage those of you in the audience as you have questions, as we're talking. If something is relevant, please send in your questions. I know this is us presenting, but it's also very important for those of you in the audience today to get your questions answered. So just to frame where we're headed, this is a huge topic. We could spend a whole week and not cover everything that's important to thinking about your internal operations. But for today's purposes, I wanted to frame the conversation and give you a sense of the basics. As people are considering starting an enterprise, one of the things that I always want to start with is that a nonprofit is the same as a business entity. It just has a different return on investment. And so just to give you a sense of where the nonprofit sector sits in terms of the landscape, is in today's market, there's roughly 1.4 million nonprofit organizations that fall under the tax exempt status. In 2010, nonprofits accounted for 9.2% of all wages and salaries paid in the United States. And the nonprofit share of the GDP is roughly 5.5%. It gives you a sense of that this is a big market. Nonprofits, I think at one point were seen as a very small player, but in today's economic standpoint, it's a major contender, it's a major player. And one thing I know from being in the funding community is that this sector is growing. It is not shrinking. It's filling the gap that government can no longer fill and no longer sees that it has a role in. It also provides opportunities for all kinds of research and health advancements. It adds to the cultural opportunities of cities. It educates our children. It upholds people's faiths. It feeds, shelters, and provides much needed services to those in need. And obviously I'm missing some buckets, but you get the general sense that this is a pretty robust field. And so when you enter the field, there are some things that you need to think about. One of the things that in my consulting work is I'd go out and I would meet with people who wanted to start organizations, and I would say, have you done the research? Who else is playing in the field that you hope to be playing in? Have you done your research? Are you filling a unique proposition in the community? Who else is doing what you're doing? Who will you serve and how will you serve them? And sometimes I'm shocked that people don't have strong answers to those questions. So that's like the first step. There's lots of ways to gather that information. There's organizations like GuideStar, Charity Navigator. Many cities have 211 call centers that you can then start to gather information. Community foundations also tend to be a great place to start looking at what kinds of organizations already exist and might already be doing what you're hoping to do. So the first step, the first basic step is market research. And it's one of those things that when Francisco and I were talking about today, we were thinking about, how do you present this information in a succinct way? It's hard because there's lots of ways to start an organization. There's lots of paths to go down. There's no I wouldn't say there's one right way. There's many ways. But one thing I would offer you to consider is thinking about when you're going to create the business case for the organization. It's no longer enough for donors to see that you're just meeting the mission. One thing that from the funding community, which I think sets us up nicely for next week's conversation, where you'll hear lots of opportunities to engage with funders, is funders are watching organizations very closely, and especially with the economic downfall in 2008, 2009, and 2010, funders no longer had the privilege or the opportunity to fund lots of organizations with small amounts, organizations that were feeding the needy or working with vets or providing educational services to children. What we were seeing is that organizations that didn't have strong internal capacity were struggling to keep their doors open, and they were no longer meeting the programmatic needs of the organization because they were spending so much time internally trying to fix some of the systems and policies and procedures that they didn't actually have solidified. So that's one of the things that we're going to get to today. So I would challenge you to think about the old way of creating the business case as the social need equals the social contribution, equals to incorporation, equals organize, then find resources and execute. One of the things that I know that I believe and that Francisco believes is that it's no longer enough just to see the pattern that way, but you have to look at creating a social enterprise or any type of organizations by thinking about the impact first. What is it that you're trying to change, and setting up your organization from that framework, as opposed to, saying there's a need and then we're just going to jump in and fix it. What I think we would like to suggest to you today is that you have to isolate the systematic drivers of the issue. You have to develop a sustainable impact model. Then you can incorporate. Then you organize. You find resources. You execute on the mission. You evaluate. You then refine, and refine. And so those are the steps that we'll walk you through today. And I know that was a lot, but hopefully it'll make sense in a second as we go through this. One of the things when you are thinking about your mission, it used to be that was enough. That if you had a strong mission statement, funders would line up and they would say, yes, I believe in what you're trying to do. But now, really, it's about the vision statement. Organizations really need to have a strong vision about where they're going. It's not enough just to say that you're going to meet a community need. It's about telling the community how you're going to meet that need, why there's a case for you to exist, how you're going to solve the problem, and how you are going to get there, and in what time frame you think you'll get there. Now, of course, this is all a continuum. But really it's about discussing the proposition for the community at the beginning stages for impact, and that will drive how you incorporate. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Francisco, who this is really, when I met Francisco back in Denver, Colorado, this was the beginning of a great friendship. He is a talented consultant. During my time at SVP, had talked about bringing him in to do some work with some of the organizations we were funding, because this is really a truly valued perspective in the funding community, thinking about your impact from the beginning so that way you can set up the internal operations that you need before you incorporate and before you start building your board, building your staffs, and thinking about how you can evaluate. So with that, Francisco?
So one way to think about it, if we go back to that slide, that says planning for impact, if we really want to think in terms of where the market, if you will, for nonprofits is going and funder donor expectations are going, if we were to say in the world of for-profit, there's profit, right? Profit is the bottom line that says that you actually have a service that has a model, that has a concept, that has an engine that actually, lots of people have great ideas for products that might be useful. Lots of people have great ideas that have products valued, but it's not the same as saying by the time you apply all of the inputs and the outputs and the cost of manufacturing and the cost of personnel and everything else like that, the return on investment actually leads to profit. That you're actually bringing in more dollars than you're sending out in the form of your investment. Well, in a lot of ways, then we can think about impact as the equivalent of profit in the social sector, right? Because when we think about the old way of thinking about social concerns, it was really, we could contrast impact with, say, charity. And the approach of charity, which was really saying, you have population X that is at a disadvantage, due to any number of reasons. It could be returning veterans. Here I'm in San Antonio, Texas, and we are Military City, USA, home of the Center for the Intrepid over at Joint Base San Antonio, which does some amazing work with wounded warriors. I'm involved in a coalition of veteran serving organizations sponsored by the San Antonio Area Foundation that come together to do capacity building. And we have this conversation all the time. You can have a population of veterans that have a need, and the charity model would be, well, let's find out what that need is, and then let's take up a collection and round up some money and go do the best that we can to buy the resource that they're missing, and then give it to them, and try and keep our costs down. And as Lisa said, prior to the economic bust, there was enough money flowing around out there that you could get away with operating like that. But nowadays, in such a resource-based environment, funders, donors, even constituents and recipients are looking to see how are you creating a vision for how this is going to work. What is the clockwork for the social enterprise that you're putting together that is actually going to move the needle on the fundamental concern, not on the symptomatic concern, right? So if you are engaged in, say, a nonprofit that's working to match returning unemployed veterans with employment, certainly one of the things that you need to think about doing, that you ought to be doing, is job training and matching them with employers. But there's also now an expectation that you engage in advocacy work, right? We're actually doing systems change. So an example is there are coalition organizations here in San Antonio and elsewhere that have worked really hard with the legislature for the state of Texas that job credentials acquired by service members in the military are validated and transfer over to their civilian equivalent without those service members having to go back and take all that training over again or get no credit for that training. And so from a systems change standpoint, from an impact standpoint, it's not enough to just find the veteran who needs a job and connect them with employment. You also have to be working to address some of the underlying concerns and some of the ecosystem barriers and factors that are going to hinder that veteran's ability to get other jobs in the future and all the veterans that come after them. Right? So when we talk about impact, yes, you're delivering a service that people want and need, but you're also doing it in a context taking on the bigger picture ecosystem barriers and drivers that aggravate that concern. And that's what funders are really looking for. They want to see that you are approaching things in a way that over time, when successful, your vision for the organization actually leads to an elimination or a statistically significant reduction in the need that you're tackling in the first place. Lisa?
Exactly. So when you think about planning for impact, as Francisco just said, you have to really think about the operation that you want to be operating in. Do you want to do it as a nonprofit 501c3? Do you want to become an advocacy organization? Or does it make sense to be a for-profit that has a social enterprise attached to it, and that, at the end of the day, the money that you earn it either goes back into the program, which is very similar to the nonprofit model, where you have a nonprofit with a social enterprise. At the end of the day, all the extra money goes back into the programming. But in a for-profit, obviously, some money goes back to the shareholders. But more and more companies are starting to say, we want to have a social impact, we want to have a social good. At the end of the day, we'll take some of that investment and that we've earned, and we'll put it back into the company, and the shareholders will get less. So when you get to thinking about incorporating, for today's purposes, we'll talk about the steps to incorporating as a nonprofit. So if we can go to that slide, I think that's 2 slides up. So one of the things that I was trying to do is try to figure out a way to do this so it encompasses everybody across the country, but each state operates very differently. I'm sure that will be no shock to any of you. As you file for your articles of incorporation, sometimes you're going to do it with the Secretary of State's office. Sometimes you're going to do it with a different agency. So we've left the link there for you so you can look by state how you incorporate. After you incorporate, you definitely want to apply for your non-exempt or your tax-exempt status through the IRS. Mental note, it can take up to a year to receive that paperwork. So some organizations will say, I'm ready to go, but actually I think that's a great time for people to step back and do some more planning, bring people to the table that need to be part of the visioning that we were just talking about. And then the last thing that you need to do is you need to register with your state to do fundraising. And that's a step that a lot of nonprofits forget. They think once they incorporate and once they get their tax-exempt status, they can just start doing their programming and start raising money, but you actually have to file with the state where you plan to do fundraising activities. People always ask, well, what if I plan to fundraise? Let's say I'm based in San Antonio, Texas, but I have some donors in Colorado and I have some donors in Michigan. That's okay. You just have to incorporate in the state where you are doing a majority of your fundraising. If you decide that you would like to franchise, then yes, you are going to have to seek that fundraising activity status from each state. So that's just a mental step that you have to make sure you take before you go forward. Great, thank you. So as you're thinking about your organization, you're at the stage where you filed all the correct paperwork. You probably have had a lawyer help you with some of that paperwork. It's pretty lengthy and it gets pretty technical. This is where you're going to start thinking about your network. Initially, you may have the idea. You may talk with a few other people who may think your idea is a great idea, but then you have to seek people in the community who actually may not be that close to you, but are experts in the area that you are hoping to work. So if you're going to be working in veterans organization, let's say you might want to contact your local VA, you might want to contact other nonprofits that are doing similar services but may have a different focus than you. They might have some ideas and they may have some staff expertise to share with you. For the board of directors, one of the things that is key, I think, in terms of having a strong nonprofit board is having a variety of voices. It's not enough anymore to just have your large funder, your lawyer, your CPA, your marketing expert, those are all valuable, but also inviting somebody who is a potential client or is a client to serve on the board so that their voice is heard in that process, because your board is really the strategy driver. Those are the people who make sure that you are staying on vision. They're the people that make sure that you're financially operating soundly. They are the people who will create the strategic plan. Initially it may be a 3-year strategic plan, and then they may go to a 5 or a 10-year strategic plan. So that's why you want to think about that group of people, and you want to make sure as many voices that need to be in the room are there to participate in that conversation. Initially, a lot of organizations start off with one staff person. It's usually the founder of the organization. They're usually termed the executive director. As you start to build out staff, one of the things to consider is who is going to not only add to your fundraising efforts, but also can deliver strong programming. I worked with a lot of nonprofits, and I'm sure Francisco can chime in here, where some of the most successful smaller staffs are the people who really have a variety of different skills that they can bring to the table. They're not only an expert on fundraising or in program development, but can do both. Those people tend to be hard to find, but it's worth putting the investment in finding them. Key partners and collaborators, and that's other organizations. Who can you partner with to deliver better services? One of the most effective one of the most.
Can I jump in?
Oh yes, please, Francisco, please.
So a word on board members and staff. Can you not go forward to the life cycle slide that shows us the arc? So when we nonprofits, there is this very well-established model, a lot of great research behind it, that thinks in terms of the nonprofit life cycle, which is similar in other institutional settings. We talk about institutional life cycle too. But this is particular nonprofit world in terms of how it affects the composition of your staff and your board. So if we're looking at the arc, in the startup phase, usually a new nonprofit or social enterprise starts with kind of a messianic founder, if you will, right? They'll have someone that just absolutely has a personal connection and a passion to the cause and the concerns that they want to take on. So typically in the very beginning, you'll have this messianic founder at the center of the thing, and the board of directors is frequently composed of close friends, business colleagues, associates, people who are really there to support the founder's dream, but not necessarily people that are to oversee good governance of a social concern. And the truth is, we kind of need that, right? That when a nonprofit is first setting up, just like a startup business, you got to be lean and mean, and there's got to be a lot of room to shift on the fly as the founder is kind of learning new lessons, having new conversations that lead to insights and fundamental shifts in strategy. And so that's useful that you have these cheerleaders as your board that are kind of hands-on. But then what happens is that the organization begins to form programming and to take on obligations and take on commitments. That's the point where the founder actually does need a little bit of oversight, does need to be held accountable to kind of stay on track, because it's very easy for the kind of leadership personality that tends to have that messianic zeal at the beginning to be easily carried by their passions. And so as the organization starts to really take on a life of its own, having a board of directors that begins to stabilize that direction and acts as a counterbalance so that pivot kind of a little hastily is important. And so then what begins to happen is as you staff up along the lines of what Lisa was talking about, as you move into adolescence, so looking at the chart, that stitch from the beginning into the growth phase, as we move into adolescence, another diagnostic characteristic is that you tend to hire generalists. And so it's kind of a cheap cook and bottle washer, all hands on deck, where everybody shares a little bit of the responsibility. And that's good because the organization is still finding its way. They're still not very clear on what the requirements of service delivery may look like from moment to moment, day to day. And having a team of people that have very small egos and are willing to do whatever it takes to get the job done is a plus. But now here's the rub, and here's the thing that is where I spend a lot of my time in my practice. That as you grow the organization, there comes a point diagnostically when you're trying to move from early adolescence or from adolescence, where having generalists becomes a real liability. An indicator of organizational maturity is that you've now moved to a specialist structure where you're able to hire people that are able to build really deep and significant expertise in pieces of the mission, in pieces of the work, and they're able to really be viewed as kind of best-in-class subject matter experts for that piece of the work. So if you have somebody that's involved in job training, that person is a world-class job trainer. They're not a job trainer one minute, a case manager the next minute, and a fundraiser the next minute. Right? And so a big part of success in nonprofit leadership is being willing for the stages of development and being willing to make the changes and grow as is needed. Because if you insist on keeping that generalist mentality, and in fact, I would say with several veteran service organizations that I've spent time with, that can also be a real tendency, right? Where maybe your volunteer base and your staff base is former service members or family members of former service members. A lot of esprit de corps and a lot of pride that comes into we all do what's needed. Well, the reality is organization to really grow into something sophisticated and powerful that makes a real impact. You can't say, all hands on deck forever. You really do, like any successful business stage of development where you have experts that are the best at their game and able to do that well. And so along those same lines then, part of what happens is your board also has to evolve. You have to be able to go from that early stage of cheerleaders on the team to now having people with specialized expertise and relationships and assets that are going to help you grow the business, so to speak. And I feel I really struggle because staff that has outgrown and moved into maturity, but they still have boards of directors that are behaving like startups. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes when you have a board of directors that say everybody on the board has been on that board for like 7 years, and they're still living in a mental model of what it was when we were the small mom and pop, it's us against the world kind of concern, that board of directors may not have the level of understanding and the level of professionalism to do what they have to do as a board to organization, grow powerfully, acquire new assets, build new inroads with other institutions, and those kind of collaborative partnerships that are critical to growth. So, it's important to really capture the esprit de corps that shows up at different moments, but you also have to know going in that there is a shelf life, there is a life cycle to some of that early enthusiasm, that if you don't move from enthusiasm to professionalism, then you lose your edge and kind of go early into decline. Lisa?
Yeah, and that actually leads really nicely to the next slide. One of the key things about the board of directors is evaluating. One of the things we used to find is when we go into organizations, we would say, well, can we see your board evaluation? Not just evaluation of the program, but the board evaluation. And they would say, we haven't evaluated ourselves. And that's a key component of a successful organization and making sure that internally you're operating well. Each member of the team, whether it's the board, the executive director, the staff, the volunteers, and then the program staff, everybody needs to evaluate their role. And one of the tools that I've used, I haven't used this one specifically, but I've used one very similar. This one was developed by Speakman Management Consulting, and you can see the notation on the bottom to give them proper citation, but is walking yourself through the nonprofit organizational life cycle chart like this is actually really helpful to understanding where an organization you are in terms of your internal structure and whether or not you are sound. What I used to do with a tool like this, and you can use this one as well, is have each member go on their own, sit down, look at each of these sections and give themselves a score on a scale that you all agree on, and then come back together to see where people think that they actually are. It's a very interesting opportunity for the board to do that kind of exercise. And when I would come in with my group of business professionals to help organizations determine where they needed help in regards to building their organizational capacity, I was never shocked to find that people saw themselves all over the place. One is that there's usually a lack of communication. Sometimes we would find boards would say, oh, but the staff didn't tell us that. And so we would develop systems to make sure that there was communication back and forth between the board and the staff. But even amongst the board, kind of like what Francisco was saying, in terms of boards are in various stages as well as in terms of organizational capacity. And so people come to boards for all different reasons, but sometimes using a tool like that will help you realize where you need to improve your board. Sometimes it will help you realize who needs to step off of the board if you don't already have that written in your bylaws, which you should, but some organizations don't put term limits in their bylaws for their board members. But using a tool like this and using it in a way to evaluate not only your board, but your executive director and your programmatic programs, it's just one of those things where this is a best practice in the field where you need to constantly, every year, some organizations I worked with did this every 6 months, to see where they were and to see how they were improving. And if you flip through this chart, you can see it's pretty lengthy, which is why we wanted to give it to you. And you could go to their website and pull it off. But you can see it talks about what your organization will look like at the grassroots level. It will look at it at the startup phase, the adolescent phase, the mature phase. And then, unfortunately, I've worked with organizations that were in stagnation and they had to decide if they were going to renew and come back around that life cycle chart that we used just a few moments ago, or whether or not they needed to help shut down. And organizations back in 2008, 2009, 2010, like I said earlier, who were not in good financial order and didn't have strong evaluation results and didn't have strong programming, did decide to shut down. And that's a whole nother set of processes to go through. But this chart, making sure that you're revisiting something like this so you understand where your organization is in relation to its own internal process and internal procedures and policies, I think is just incredibly helpful for the board. It's also really helpful from a funding perspective when a funder comes in, which I know you'll get into more greater length next week. But one of the things as a funder, when I would come in on a site visit, so we had the proposal come in, we read it, we loved their vision statement, we saw that they had strong evaluation results, we saw that they had a great board of directors, they had the right staff in place. We would come in and say, okay, let's talk about your life cycle. Let's talk about where you are in regards to, your program and services, your management, your staffing, your governance, your administrative systems, financials. And it was shocking to me in some levels that boards had no idea where they ranked. Now the staff knew, but the board wasn't on board. And that's a key component to making sure that you're running a successful organization, because the board is really, they're the governing structure. They're the ones that are fiscally responsible. They're the ones that set the strategy for the organization. And so this is from my perspective, just an amazing tool to use on so many levels within an organization to understand where you are, where you need capacity building. There's lots of organizations that provide funding for capacity building. As Social Venture Partners is one of those models. And some community foundations even have funds for that. They'll pay for people like Francisco to come in and help organizations with whatever challenges that they're facing. Francisco, I want to make sure that you comment on this as well.
I'll jump in there. Assistance provider tools like this, when developed by Susan Kennedy, Stevens, on stages of nonprofit life cycle, that really are the gospel, so to speak, the kind of the universally accepted measuring stick of organizational development. One of the things that I recommend to any of you pursuing this is most major cities, for those of you that are urban, major cities will have 1 to 3 standout philanthropies that are really considered to be the leaders for nonprofit capacity building. And so, we have the San Antonio Area Foundation. I know back when they were in Denver, SCP was one. In areas of social advocacy, the Teton Foundation was another one. But typically, any major metro will have at least a couple of philanthropies that specifically work with nonprofits on developing their capabilities. That's really useful is when you're able to see this stuff. I can't tell you how often teams that I work with just breathe a big sigh of relief, because when a team is going through some growing pains, it's very easy for members of that team or members of that board to feel very discouraged. What did we miss? What are we getting wrong? What's wrong with us that this is happening to us? That kind of stuff. And 75% of the time when me or somebody like me joins that team to help assess where they're getting stuck, is on the list. Like, it's predictably one of the growing pains that comes up as you move from stage to stage. So when you're able to really share that with people and say, hey, congratulations, the fact that you're having this particular problem means, as much of a pain in the butt as it might be, it diagnostically means that you are ready to move to the next stage of development. Great work, right? And now it's just a matter of doing the work to do that. And so I think that's one of the things that we wanted to share on the call today, that of course, if you're because you have a particular need or issue that you're passionate about and that you want to address, and you have some early ideas on what would be interventions or solutions or services that might address that need. But no one ever wants to think about the organization as a creature unto itself. It's an animal that needs care and feeding. It needs to be attended to. It needs regular doctor's visits. And you have to think about the organization as an entity itself having its own realities that are separate from the services that you provide. And so if you recognize that, respect that, and do the work to just evolve as needed, then you're able to spend much more time focusing on your fundamental issue, your service delivery package, whatever that might be. And then just on top of that, coming back to this idea of resourcing, one of the things that I wanted to mention was how do you staff up, right? And when you staff up, what does that look like? When we think in terms of the intuitive model, which would be kind of that charitable thing, it's very simple. We say we have a community constituent that has so now we have a service that we think addresses that need. So our job is to hire service providers that address that need. And that's a very, it's a very straightforward approach that makes sense. But guess what? That's actually an incredibly costly approach. And it's a very low leverage approach because in essence, you're giving fish instead of teaching the fish. And so when you really think in terms of impact, you have to look at volunteer management structures. You have to look at maybe the concern if you're worried about veteran reintegration, right? Veteran reentry into communities. It'd be very easy to say, well, okay, let's get some case managers and some veteran navigators, so to speak, that can work with individual veterans and get tied into community. But on the flip side, when we look at it back from this impact issue, a lot of what happens with veteran reintegration is a community concern, and what is the community's readiness to meet veterans where they are and reintegrate and reacclimate and interact with them in a healthy, generative, and supportive way. So in a lot of ways, the fundamental impact has more to do with changing community attitudes than it does with service delivery to the individual veteran. So if you really take a step back and look at it from an impact standpoint, yes, you could do a lot of good with navigators and case managers, but you also, if you want to change fundamental conditions for those veterans, look at community organizing and hiring organizers and getting different kinds of venues for community engagement, like education, right? So don't necessarily go with your gut on what your staffing pattern looks like. You really have to spend time with philanthropy, with other service delivery agencies in the community to really bring an A game forward. Don't just be the next agency, collecting funds to put on a show, so to speak, and hire a lot of staff that are going to get outfished, because more and more the funding ecosystem is less interested in investing in those kinds of models because it's not really viewed as sustainable. Right, but in essence, you're only going to be able to help the next veteran or the next client that your employee is able to hand assistance to directly, but you're not changing fundamental conditions. So time to really research and get wise on the range of possibilities around how you staff up and how you have a powerful model for creating community change really pays off.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that is one of the things that we've seen in the funding community is organizations that will chase money instead of really sticking to who they are and what they're trying to do. And we call that mission drift. It's where you start to take money and you start to add staff to deliver programming that doesn't actually meet your mission, your vision, and your value statement. And that's where, one of the other ways you can use the nonprofit capacity assessment tool, which is on the resource slide that's at the end of this presentation. If you run a list of questions through the capacity assessment tool when you're looking at taking funding, and it does not meet your goals, it doesn't meet your program, that's when you shouldn't participate in that funding relationship. You should walk away. And knowing when to say yes or knowing when to say no to something is just as important. Organizations can get themselves into big trouble by adding staff and delivering programming that doesn't actually meet what they're trying to do. So
we often call those gifts that eat, right? So give you an example. Back in the Red Cross days, we often had different kinds of companies in the hospitals that would also say, hey, we want to give you a big old mobile kitchen, or we want to give you a camp kitchen, or some large piece of equipment that they could put their corporate logo on the side of to try and get some visibility. And God bless them, they were legitimately wanting to help. It was a sincere gift. But the reality that we knew, being in the business that we were in, is that every O-ring and gaskets on that kitchen were replaced, every 18 months. We know that the insurance costs for moving that thing are significant. That just the annual operating cost of a piece of large-scale mobile equipment like that is actually pretty substantial. And so if somebody wanted to come to us with a gift like that, a lot of nonprofits wouldn't think twice about it, and they would just say, thank you, that's fantastic. But if you're not thinking about what's your long-term maintenance cost of that going to be,
right.
That or those kinds of opportunities where somebody's, I'll fund you if you'll just do a project like this that's off point, little by little, saying and this can actually bleed you dry and break an organization's back over time.
Correct. Well, we definitely wanted to leave time for questions, and I wanted to see if there's any questions out there at the moment so we could address those.
At this point, I don't see any that are posted or in the group chat. I know we have a few individuals who are watching live. So Anne, Jamie, or Rich, if you have any questions, please feel free to either speak up or type them out into the comment box. Rich seems like he's okay. I know that I did send over the slides to Anne. If there's anyone else that would be looking for those, just please post in the Google Plus event page, and we'll make sure that you have copies of that, because that chart was extremely useful. So thank you for sharing that.
This is Gary, and while we're waiting for other questions, I actually have one comment and then perhaps a question. And the comment is, we've talked about resource development. And would you agree that sometimes after you do your initial scan and you identify foundations or other funding sources in communities, that it's also worthwhile just to go to them and even before you put in an application, make an appointment with them, understand a little bit more about their boards, their funding history beyond what you might get from an annual report, but to see if there's really a congruence and for them to put a face to your organization. So is that a method that you would recommend before I go to a question? And yep, hi Rich. Hope you're doing well.
Well, I'll take a first stab at this, and then I'll turn it over to Francisco. Working in a community foundation, absolutely. The community foundation community is very excited to meet with people and talk with them about their grant guidelines and what will fit in their grant guidelines and what won't. But they also are a resource for organizations that are just starting out. Oftentimes, they are a connector between lawyers for incorporating. They often know the consultants in town that can help with organizational capacity building, for example, like if you need help developing your board or finding resources, working to develop the executive director. A lot of times founders they're great innovators, they're great thinkers, but sometimes they don't have all the skills that they need to lead an organization, so they might hire somebody like Francisco to do executive coaching, for example. The community foundation also oftentimes hosts information sessions, and they'll do continuing education sessions. But also they just love to sit down with organizations, learn about what they're doing in the community, and figuring out if there is a potential partnership there. One of the things that is happening in the funding community right now, they're having lots of conversations about evaluation and impact and how they're going to increase their dollars to organizations that specifically are focused on those things. And program officers are always willing to talk to organizations specifically about how to write their proposals so they can set themselves up for success, specifically looking at evaluation and impact results.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
Hopefully that answers your question.
It does, yeah. Anything on that, Francisco, or is that pretty much correlate with your experience?
I think we said well. The only other thing that I would add is just be conscious that a lot of funder program officers are used to being stalked, if you will.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yep.
Different foundations have different policies.
Mm-hmm.
Some foundations have an absolute, we have a grant process. If you want to talk to us, you have to apply through the official grant process, and we don't do interviews, and they're really serious about that. Other foundations, more like the community foundations that Lisa was talking about, have a real commitment to capacity building, so they actually kind of build it into their model that they'll spend some time with and counseling them. Others really have very explicit offers to help organizations think through that. Here, I've mentioned the San Antonio Foundation quite a bit. Here in San Antonio, they do a once-a-month workshop called To Be or Not to Be a 501c3,
right,
where they spend half a day with prospective founders, really helping them think through. But I would tell you, as a bit of tough luck, right? For city building community, for folks in the philanthropy community, it is not the obligation of philanthropy to underwrite someone's personal passion project. And sometimes that can be a little bit hard to take, right? If you're bringing something to the community or the market that's already been done, already being done, or has been done before and didn't particularly work, the philanthropic community is going to be fairly open with you that's not a service or a product that they consider the market to need. Just like if you were looking for an angel investor, right, and you had a product that you were in love with, and it was your baby, it was invention, and it sounds so great, but they said, you know what, we just don't think there's a market for that. So just like if you were an entrepreneur trying to get capital for your new startup business, and going in that you may not find that angel investor that's as passionate as you are about your cause. It's true in the philanthropic sector as well. And it's not about you. It's not about anyone trying to devalue your passion for the thing. But it is that we as a sector know that the resources are so scarce, and there are so many amazing organizations with legitimate high-impact value propositions struggling to get the resources they need to keep on doing it, that collectively the capacity building space has a low tolerance for half-thought-out plans that don't really have clear impact propositions.
Yeah, absolutely.
That makes sense. So, Mike, a little time check. Do I have time for my question, actually, or?
We have a few minutes. We did have a question come through from Willie Blue on Google+.
Yep.
Willie Blue's question is, if you are a for-profit company, should you place the social commitment in your business plan or mission statement as a percentage of your revenue?
Great question.
That's a good question. Yeah.
That's a great question. Francisco?
I would say if it's something that you're actually building as part of your basic platform for the business, so like Tom's shoes, right, where for every pair of shoes that's bought, a pair of shoes is given, right? Or there's an amazing boutique ice cream shop in Denver, Colorado called Little Man Ice Cream, where for every scoop of ice cream that's bought, they donate a scoop of rice to an international development partner, right? If your business is actually baking in that kind of giving as a fundamental part of what you're up to, sure, it makes including your mission statement, but if it's kind of a secondary, tertiary kind of fringe thing that's like a value and a commitment, maybe that belongs in your statement of but doesn't necessarily belong in your mission statement.
Great, thank you very much, Willie. I hope that answered your question. Yeah, Gary, we have about 2 minutes left before we need to wrap up here.
Okay, great. Well, my question's a pretty quick one. So earlier on, you talked about the various resources for establishing status with the IRS and also with charities. And you had put the charities registration at the end. But isn't it true that in order to get your organization up and started locally, you might want to begin with your own state-based charities registration so that you can begin bringing your board on and accepting donations, gathering your resources, and then taking on your not-for-profit status afterwards. Do you want to comment on that, or is it otherwise?
No, that's true, Gary. And on that slide, the first one talks about files articles of incorporation with the Secretary of State's office, and that's exactly the first step. You have to do that. And in that, and I always recommend that people get a lawyer to help walk them through that because it is a pretty lengthy process. That is where you're going to create the initial bylaws. That's where you're going to put some of the initial thoughts down. You're going to put down a mission statement, and you're going to file that with the Secretary of State's office. That's the first step in that process. That doesn't mean whatever you put in there is what you're wedded to for the rest of your life. It's just the beginning stages, because obviously as you grow and you get more sophisticated and you go through your life cycle check and you're doing evaluation of the organization, you're going to make adjustments to your mission statement, your vision statement, your values proposition, and you're going to hopefully round out your bylaws, and you're going to make them more robust. I know a lot of organizations started with bylaws that said we will have 5 board members. Well, that's a very small board, and we all know that that's probably not the most practical way. That's for when you are ramping up and going through the life cycles, you're going to add people and things like that. So it's just the beginning. But that paperwork is pretty sophisticated, and again, it is by state. And so that link will lead you to your state that you live in, and it will walk you through the appropriate steps. Some states even have other processes besides just your articles of incorporation, applying for your tax-exempt status, and then filing to fundraise. So each state is totally different, and unfortunately, there's not one hard and fast rule.
That's right. That's right. Okay. It sounds to me, Mike, that we're about ready to thank our presenters, Lisa and Francisco, and I think we're at the end of our session, aren't we, Mike?
We are. So thank you very much again, Lisa and Francisco, for coming on today and sharing your expertise in this area. This presentation will be archived out on YouTube, so for those of you who are watching or participating live, please feel free to disseminate to your networks. As a reminder, next Tuesday, June 17th at 1 p.m., we will be having session 3, which is Financing Your Enterprise. And the following Tuesday, June 24th, also at 1 p.m., we'll be wrapping up the series with a presentation called External Operations. So just once again, thank you for all of those of you who participated today and presented. We appreciate it very much. For VetNet and the Institute for Veterans and Military Families, I thank you, and we'll wrap up. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you, everybody. So long.